the nightmare of a new order. A Führer, his people, and race. Crimes against humanity. A world of chaos and destruction. This is the story of humanity's darkest hour. The abyss. (1943). The German army marches into Italy. After the Allies' invasion, Italy's fascist Grand Council deposes Mussolini and breaks off the alliance with Hitler. Nazi Germany's closest partner is now its bitter adversary.
Hitler sees the Italians as traitors. They go from friends to enemies, and now they're punished. They become victims.
The Greek island of Kefalonia occupied by Germans and Italians. With Mussolini gone, the Italians are meant to disarm.
But the Italians on Kefalonia say, no, we're going to fight. And then Hitler loses it. This shows how extreme Hitler can be. If they fight back, they will know my utmost hate and savagery. Hitler simply knows no bounds, and people are killed in their thousands, tens of thousands, millions.
Hitler's hatred is not directed at Benito Mussolini. German paratroops rescue him from captivity. Hitler installs the Duce as the puppet ruler of German-occupied Italy.
Hitler's admiration for Mussolini knew no bounds. He always held up Mussolini as a genius.
The cult of the Führer, the uniforms, the theatricality of power. The Italian fascists were the blueprint for Germany's Nazis. Ever since 1922, when Mussolini and his black shirt combat squads took power after the March on Rome. Just a year later, the Nazis set out to do the same in Germany. Germany, 1923. The nascent Weimar Republic is in danger. Extremists on the right and on the left aim to destroy democracy. The militant right is split.
Of course, in that situation, the thing to do is to project an image of being very tightly organized, militaristic and militant, to send clear signals to potential supporters. Hitler did that very well.
In 1923, Adolf Hitler's NSDAP has roughly 55,000 members. His rabble-rousing speeches as party leader attract plenty of attention.
There's this idea that across party lines that a new genius had to emerge who would lead Germany out of misery. And it is already from late 1922 onwards that Hitler is being labeled by people close to him as the Bavarian Mussolini.
Meanwhile, a journalist in Munich decides to find out more about the Nazi Party and its plans. Leo Lania, from Vienna, a communist and Jew, infiltrates the inner sanctums of the party.
He had a fake party membership card in the name of Arnaldo Mussolini, Benito's brother. He told the Nazis in Munich that the Duce was hugely impressed by the German Führer and wanted to learn more about him, so he appealed to their vanity.
With a forged letter of recommendation, Leo Lania infiltrates the newsroom of the party newspaper, the Völkische Beobachter.
If these people had known who he was, things would have got very nasty. They wouldn't have thought twice about murdering him.
In the early 1920s, murders of political opponents, especially Jews and communists, were not unusual. To maintain his cover, Leo Lania speaks Italian to the Nazis via an interpreter. Lania has free entry to the newsroom. One day, an editor hints at a plan, something about a big operation. In a book, Leo Lania later repeats his words.
But I can tell you this, we have enough weapons. Way more than enough.
At first, senior Nazis in Munich see no need for suspicion. Lania even gets close to the party leader, Adolf Hitler. Wanting to appear decisive, Hitler makes some ambitious claims.
Hitler speaks in a clipped, consciously military manner. Well, in a couple of weeks, we'll set things straight.
Is Hitler just grandstanding? Or are the Nazis really planning a coup d'etat? An attack on democracy?
The threat from the right is growing in Bavaria. This is particularly dangerous because men like Ludendorff are leading paramilitary groups too, and they're in contact with Hitler. So the violence and strength of the right increased considerably in the course of 1923.
The NSDAP are effective agitators and good at mobilizing their supporters. The police and the justice system barely intervene.
The NSDAP worked hard to give its members shared emotional experiences. Marches, torchlight processions, and of course the shared exercise of violence were meant to bind people together.
After 8 days undercover among Nazis, Leo Lania finds himself in a distinctly awkward situation. His interpreter turns up at his hotel with 2 Ukrainian fascists who have just arrived from Italy.
Of course, Lania realizes at once he's in danger, and he decides his only chance is to go somewhere where there are lots of people. So he tells them he has a meeting with the Italian ambassador at Munich's Hofbräuhaus.
In the crush at the Hofbräuhaus, Lania manages to slip out through a back door.
He goes back to his hotel in Munich, and he notices that his room has been searched. So he knows the game is up. He's got to get out. His life is in danger.
Just in time, Leo Lania boards a train leaving Munich. Within 4 weeks of Lania's investigation at the Völkische Beobachter newspaper, Hitler is ready to make history in Munich.
Hitler realizes that his supporters start to say Hitler is all about words but not about action, and it is at that point that he just decides that he will gamble everything on one card, that he will go for broke, and it is at that point that he decides to lead the putsch.
On the evening of November the 8th, 1923, he and his followers disrupt the Bavarian Prime Minister's rally at Munich's Bürgerbräu beer hall. Hitler declares that Bavaria's government has been overthrown. He now plans to march on the capital city, like his hero Benito Mussolini, and so seize power in the entire country. But he doesn't get that far. After a few hundred meters, the putschists are stopped by the Bavarian state police.
The inspiration that Hitler took from the March on Rome ends in disaster, in a hail of bullets, dead and wounded. At this stage, Mussolini doesn't take Hitler seriously, above all because of the failed putsch. Hitler's a nobody. Mussolini believes Hitler has the wrong strategy and no prospect of political success.
The plot's leaders are roundly mocked for their failure. Hitler seems to be finished. The NSDAP is banned. Its assets are confiscated. The Völkische Beobachter ceases publication.
Hitler failed miserably. He made elementary mistakes in the preparation and in the execution of the putsch. All he could do was try to make it look like a victory in retrospect. "This was your victory," was the slogan at the great celebrations that took place in Munich every year after 1933. The idea was to whitewash this failure. It began with the cult of the so-called blood flag, which was presented at the party rallies and other big Nazi events, more or less like a holy relic.
The Munich debacle is rewritten as a sacrificial offering, a carefully crafted lie.
Nazism was successful partly because it was political theater. And political theater needs its script, and it needs its enemies, and it needs its events.
On the exact spot where the 1923 putsch had been so unceremoniously routed, the Nazis later erect a temple of honor. Anyone walking past has to give the Nazi salute. (1923). In the same year as the failed putsch, 100,000 French and Belgian soldiers had occupied the center of Germany's heavy industry, the Ruhr region.
1923 was a crisis year. Many political structures collapsed under the strain of conflicting demands.
France has occupied parts of the Rhineland since 1918. When Germany stops paying the reparations imposed under the Versailles Treaty, the Belgians and French take control of the Ruhr region, including its coal mines.
In doing so, France was trying to go beyond the Versailles Treaty to make political capital on its own behalf. It was obvious that this was going to inflame nationalist feeling in Germany.
The Weimar Republic cannot defend itself militarily. President Ebert calls for passive resistance. Fury at the victorious powers grows, not least because French colonial soldiers are among the occupying forces.
Many Germans saw this as a particular calculated insult. There was a widespread feeling among Germans that it's one thing to lose a war and to be occupied by a neighboring European power, but then to be under occupation from people who many Germans would have seen as existing on a somewhat lower civilizational level. That seems like an insult. Even people in the left of the political spectrum, like Reich President Friedrich Ebert.
Social Democrat Friedrich Ebert in a 1923 speech.
Using colored troops at the lowest level of culture as overseers of a population of the prominence of the people of the Rhineland is a violation of the laws of European civilization. This must once again be proclaimed to the world.
During the occupation of the Rhineland and the Ruhr, racial prejudice and race hatred are deliberately provoked and instrumentalized.
From the very beginning, the whole thing was strongly sexualized. It was basically the idea that the black colonial troops would rape and maraud their way through the occupied areas.
A medallion struck in 1920 clearly captures the racist agitation. The situation is tense. French soldiers knock the hats off civilians who fail to salute them. An officer of the occupying forces is murdered. In all, around 100 people are killed, many under the so-called atonement measures of the occupiers. Albert Leo Schlageter, an NSDAP sympathizer, takes part in the sabotage of a railway bridge. a French military court condemns him to death. The verdict has people queuing up to join the militant right in Germany.
The death of people like Leo Schlageter generates a kind of legend, the creation of martyrs murdered by the archenemy, France. And of course that's important, because if you see National Socialism as a kind of secular religion, it needs its martyrs.
For years, the Nazis make capital out of the occupation of the Ruhr. 10 years later, commemorations are still being held and monuments erected to the supposed martyr, Leo Schlageter. Streets, bridges, and even a Luftwaffe squadron are named after him. The cult of the dead is used to give meaning to life. In 1923, during the occupation, the German government prints more and more money, in part to support the striking workers of the Ruhr. The consequences are disastrous. The German currency loses almost all of its value.
In November 1923, inflation reached unimaginable levels. People weren't counting in millions and billions, but in hundreds of billions and trillions.
In April 1922 in Berlin, an egg cost about 4 marks. By January 1923, the price had gone up to 139 marks. Just 8 months later, in November, a single egg cost 320 billion marks. In the space of a few months, millions of Germans are forced into poverty. A whole generation are robbed of their savings.
It dispossessed an entire social class, everyone living off their savings, off their capital. That's to say, those who were living responsibly within their means, who had carefully managed their finances, found that their savings had lost all their value.
Hyperinflation brings poverty and mass unemployment. In 1922, 1 million Germans are out of work. By the end of 1923, it is 4 million.
Humiliation is probably the most dangerous political emotion. The fact that Germans are experiencing hardship, which they feel to be coming at them from the hands of the World War I enemies who are now in many ways controlling Germany, and this is coupled with hyperinflation in the early 1920s and then a few years later, the onset of the Great Depression. That combination of economic hardship and humiliation is the really potent thing, I think, that gives force to the argument Hitler makes that he and his movement can save the situation and restore German pride.
In 1923, the Weimar Republic is staggering from crisis to crisis. The Nazis had believed their putsch on November the 8th, 1923, would be the final blow.
In 1923, Germany was on the verge of collapse through both external and internal pressures. And yet there followed a period of 5 years in which the Weimar Republic seemed to rally.
After the crisis year of 1923, Germany seems to become more stable. A currency reform introduces the new Reichsmark. Foreign credits and an easement of reparations aid economic recovery. The Dawes Plan adjusts Germany's obligations to the victorious powers. Germany will now pay annual reparations of up to 2.5 billion Reichsmark. The Reich will receive a loan of 800 million Reichsmark. In exchange, the railways and the Reich Central Bank will come under international supervision. Measures designed to keep the young German democracy alive.
The so-called stabilization of the Weimar Republic after 1924 was apparent rather than real. You simply have to realize that large sections of the old elites rejected democracy, and that democracy didn't have deep roots in the population as a whole.
And yet many benefit from greater freedom in society.
The first German democracy granted the Germans civil liberties they have never known before. The state no longer saw itself as the enforcer of morals. Especially at the beginning, the Weimar Republic was filled with an unprecedented spirit of optimism.
Culture, science and technology develop at an astonishing rate. The number of cars on the road rises from barely 60,000 in 1921 to almost 350,000 in 1928. Technical progress captures the imagination of many Germans. This spirit is embodied by doctor and technology writer Fritz Kahn. His books become bestsellers. He's the popular science star of the 1920s. Kahn explains the human body with spectacular illustrations. The brain is a switchboard, the heart a piston pump, the stomach a refinery. This is the body as an efficient technological system. Fritz Kahn doesn't just revolutionize the art of illustration. He also becomes well known for his work in sex education. Kahn feels a responsibility to science and believes in freedom and enlightenment. And he's Jewish. That makes him a perfect bogeyman for right-wing radicals.
They tended then to equate modern art, modern music, sexual degeneracy as they saw it, with a Jewish influence. And that, of course, is complete paranoid fantasy. So the modernist spirit that infuses a lot of Weimar culture is led back by the ultra-right, including the Nazis and Hitler especially, to kind of Jewish subversion.
After the Nazis rise to power, the books of Fritz Kahn, loved by so many Germans, are burned. Fritz Kahn loses his license to practice medicine, and as a Jew in Germany, his very existence comes under threat. He emigrates, first via Palestine and France, and then, with Albert Einstein's help, he reaches the United States in 1941. After the war, he returns to Europe, dying in Switzerland in 1968. His readers' enthusiasm, and at the same time, the naked hatred of the Nazis. Fritz Kahn's experience reflects the extreme tensions of the Weimar Republic from the very beginning.
The 1920s are accompanied by deep insecurities and profound fissures in society, divisions between town and country, between farming areas and a metropolis like Berlin, which for many contemporaries was a kind of Moloch, a false and violent idol. And there was a chasm between the workers and the middle classes, between labor and capital. Divisions in society were deep.
The 1925 election shows just how deep. Following Friedrich Ebert's premature death at 54, Germany must elect a new Reich president. There are two main candidates: Conservative Democrat Wilhelm Marx of the Catholic Centre Party, and the 77-year-old First World War Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg. Many of his supporters are opponents of democracy.
Hindenburg never really engaged with the liberal grounding principles of Weimar democracy. The basic idea of the Weimar Constitution, freedom, was one that he had never truly taken to heart.
innerlich ans Herz gewachsen war.
Hindenburg receives 48.3% of the vote. Wilhelm Marx of the Catholic Centre Party, 45.3%. This narrow victory by 3% will turn out to be a decisive weakening of the Republic. The new president of democratic Germany is openly militarist and monarchist.
Hindenburg worries some people who believe that, as a loyal supporter of the Kaiser, he might restore the monarchy via the back door. I think probably no one is really concerned about the possibility of a fascist dictatorship being introduced under Hindenburg, at least not in 1925.
Zumindest 1925.
Hindenburg stands for a Prussian sense of order and military discipline, ideas that are still important to many Germans even after the lost war. And they're fostered in a number of veterans groups and student fraternities.
There is obviously a particular cultural milieu that values ideas of militarism, aggressivity, manliness. And of course, that's a perfect basis for the representatives of a populist ideology to build on and recruit people.
One man, agriculture student Heinrich Himmler, is an enthusiastic member of a student fraternity. The son of a high school principal, he's had a humanistic education. In the 1920s, he becomes a radical anti-Semite. In 1923, he joins the NSDAP and takes part in Hitler's putsch.
Heinrich Himmler is one of the people whose cool organizational abilities became more and more important to Hitler. Himmler was a background man. He wasn't someone to claim the limelight as a fiery speaker.
Himmler carves out a party career, and in 1929 he becomes Reichsführer of the notorious SS, the paramilitary security organization. Himmler already sees the SS as more than just crude and violent Nazi enforcers.
The SS is a small security organization, but he systematically builds it into a virtually independent organization that sees itself as extremely elite and makes a concerted attempt to start a dialogue with academics. One of its core beliefs is that the racial merit of an applicant can be seen in his face. So Himmler insists on seeing photos of every applicant for membership.
In the 1930s, SS men need Himmler's personal permission to marry, to be certain the future spouse is truly Aryan, a racial mania that will have murderous consequences.
Himmler was an utterly convinced racist. He took Hitler's call to fundamentally renew the racial biology of the German people quite literally. He saw the SS as a laboratory to bring the German people racially and biologically into line with National Socialist standards.
In 1933, this contempt for humanity becomes national policy. The perpetrators are quite open about their intentions. It's a disaster foretold. (1924). In Munich, Adolf Hitler must answer to the courts for his putsch attempt. The charge is high treason. The prosecutor, representing the Democratic Republic, is impressed by the defendant. He praises him as a man prepared to sacrifice himself for his ideals, a man who deserves the highest respect.
At the trial, it's clear that many in the justice system actively sympathize with politicians who use violence in support of their political ends, in the national interest.
Das Gericht bestätigt ja
The court welcomes and endorses Hitler's nationalist mindset.
Einstellung, die auch begrüßt wird.
Hitler turns the trial into political theatre, casting himself as the victim and the establishment of German democracy as an act of betrayal. Almost unopposed, he uses the court as a platform for propaganda speeches against the Republic.
The trial gives him a national platform such as he has never had before, with extensive media coverage, which he knows how to use effectively to present himself as the heroic leading figure of the radical nationalist right.
Undercover journalist Leo Lania is an observer at the trial in Munich, shortly after his own clandestine investigations into the Nazis.
Lania recognized the trial as the farce it was. There was never any real intention to uncover the facts. He was shocked because he believed that a republic, a democracy that functioned like that, could never survive.
Leo Lania publishes an account of the trial. He writes, "The putsch was the most significant political event in Germany since the revolution." His warning falls on deaf ears.
We're talking about an extremely polarized situation here. That leads to people, today we'd call it living in an information bubble. You only listen to your own side. You pay no attention to information from the opposite side, or even from moderate people in the middle. You only listen to propaganda from your side.
Leo Lania, one of the few who clearly recognized the danger of the Nazis, flees Germany in the early 1930s, shortly before they seize power. He spends years as a writer and journalist in the United States. He dies of a heart attack in Munich in 1961. And in Munich in 1924, the judges in Hitler's trial announce their verdicts. Erich Ludendorff, one of the chief conspirators, is acquitted. Hitler is sentenced to 5 years in jail. With good behavior, he can be free in a few months.
The trial has become notorious for the laughably light sentences handed out to the conspirators. High treason against the Republic could have been punishable by death. That didn't happen. You have to acknowledge that the Weimar Republic cracked down far harder against coup attempts from the left than from the right.
Between 1919 and 1922, more than 300 murders by right-wing extremists go unpunished. While in prison, Hitler writes a book. It's a mixture of sugar-coated autobiography and radical polemic. In Mein Kampf, he states unequivocally that Germany's territory must be enlarged. And Hitler gives free rein to his hatred of the Jews.
He is and remains the eternal parasite, a freeloader and scrounger, forever spreading like a bacterium. And wherever he appears, the host nation withers and dies away.
Mein Kampf enhanced Hitler's standing in nationalist and ethnically minded circles as the custodian of a race-based ideology which had never been laid out so cohesively before.
The first volume of Mein Kampf was published in 1925. After 1933, it was the most widely bought book in Germany. But was it also the most widely read?
Back then, people couldn't have anticipated that this book would have the significance that was later ascribed to it. On the other hand, the essential thing about Mein Kampf is that those structures, the ideology, and the ideas that Hitler subsequently tried to carry out, and to a great extent did carry out, were all there.
In December 1924, Hitler is free after just 8 months in prison. From now on, he pursues a new strategy, that of the wolf in sheep's clothing.
Hitler draws his conclusions from the failed putsch And he now mounts a twin-track strategy, similar to the one that brought Mussolini to power. On the one hand, he escalates terror on the streets, while at the same time recasting himself as a legitimate politician.
Italian fascists are the models for Germany's Nazis, in spite of ideological differences. For instance, anti-Semitism scarcely plays any role in the early years of Italian fascism.
It's interesting
that in Italy in the early years there were fascist Jews. That's mainly due to the fact that nationalist aspirations found fertile ground among a very patriotic, very middle-class Jewish minority in Italy.
Among more than 1 million members of Italy's fascist party, there are, until 1938, nearly 7,000 Jews. One of them is the banker Ettore Ovazza. At the beginning of the 1920s, many are terrified of a communist revolution. Ovazza, an ardent nationalist, becomes a fervent admirer of Mussolini. For a long time, Mussolini's anti-Semitism is not reflected in his policies. In 1933, he even welcomes Jewish refugees from Germany. Anti-Semitic laws are only introduced 5 years later. Jews are dispossessed, expelled from schools and universities, and excluded from the party. As the Duce moves closer to Hitler,
you have the situation where the Rome-Berlin axis is announced in 1936. That's to say the alliance is formalized on an equal footing. 1938 is the ideal moment to strengthen the relationship ideologically by aligning fascist Italy with Nazi Germany via the adoption of race laws. So the ideological convergence is reinforced too.
Ettore Ovazza first loses his position in the bank, then his house, and the greater part of his fortune. He tries to flee Italy with his wife and 2 children, but they're captured by SS men in 1943 and murdered. The killers burn their bodies.
The exterminatory impulse in Nazi anti-Semitism is there from the very start. It's not prominent as it becomes later on, but violence towards the Jews is always part of the Nazi program.
Anti-Semitism has been central to Nazism from the early years. One of its most extreme exponents is Julius Streicher, founder of the hate sheet Der Stürmer.
Streicher is well known as a radical anti-Semite in the movement, constantly working to push the boundaries of what can be said or shown.
Der Stürmer first appears in 1923. Julius Streicher's weekly spreads messages of hate. From 1927, every edition carries the slogan, "The Jews are our ruin." Der Stürmer propagates a Jewish Bolshevist global conspiracy and openly calls for violence in response.
Right from the 1920s, Streicher was responsible for acts of violence against Jews. The whole way in which he used the Stürmer as an instrument of pressure to put Jews out of business, to get them their names and stories about them into his rag, then to find that some of them going along the street would be beaten up by young radical thugs. He was very, very important in both instigating and legitimising violence and putting across this whole stereotype, this whole caricature that seemed to legitimise that kind of violence. So there is no doubt that he was very, very influential.
Julius Streicher, a middle school teacher, was one of the very first members of the NSDAP. He marched with his close friend Adolf Hitler at the beer hall putsch. Streicher's anti-Semitism has an unmistakable tone.
Streicher linked anti-Semitism with sexual fantasies in a particularly repellent way. That gives a profound insight into what may well have been his own urges.
Rabble-rousing headlines like "Starving German girls in the claws of lecherous Jewish rams" are not forbidden in the Weimar Republic. In its early years, the circulation of Der Stürmer was about 3,000 a week. After 1933, this hate sheet was read in the hundreds of thousands. By the end of the 1930s, circulation had reached 486,000 per week. (1926) sees the introduction of the Trash and Filth Law. It's intended to limit the influence of damaging publications on young people. Penny dreadful novels, harmless erotic and adventure stories all land on the index. But Der Stürmer continues to appear unhindered.
The Weimar Republic made a basic mistake. Democracy had not learned to defend itself against propaganda and agitation. By guaranteeing almost unlimited freedom of speech, it prepared the ground for the anti-Semitic and anti-democratic ideas of National Socialism.
Der Stürmer also appears in public display cases, and so by the end of the 1930s, it's reaching large numbers of young Germans. Germans who will soon be fighting Hitler's war and making mass murder possible. How influential is Der Stürmer?
It was incredibly significant because when you get young German soldiers going into Poland, seeing for the first time the ghettos, the Eastern Jews, some of them in their letters home say things like, "Yes, I now see that what we were shown in the Stürmer was real after all. Here are the Jews who look exactly like they did in the Stürmer," not registering the fact that the Jews in the ghettos in Poland had been reduced to rags and reduced to this misery specifically because of German policies. So somewhere it had an underlying kind of impact on the subconscious ideas about what the Jew might be.
After the collapse of the Nazi regime, Der Stürmer's publisher, Julius Streicher, will be prosecuted at the Nuremberg trials of the most important war criminals.
Interestingly, he really is the first person to be prosecuted before an international tribunal for hate speech. You can think about it in those terms. He never killed anyone. He never was on the battlefield. He never was in Hitler's inner circle. He was a publisher of really nasty pieces, newspapers, and articles. And I think they decided they wanted to make a principle of someone who was geeing people up, revving people up for real nastiness.
In 1946, the tribunal condemns Streicher to death by hanging for crimes against humanity. He's one of the few great fomenters of hatred against the Jews to be called to account. In 1924, the United States, a country of immigrants, introduces a controversial law. Its aim is to limit immigration using particular criteria. People from Nordic countries are welcome. Immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe less so. Those from India and East Asia, not at all.
The 1924 Immigration Act was completely racist in its basic orientation. It was absolutely racist in the kinds of groups it wanted to prefer for immigration to the United States and the kind of groups it wanted to stop or limit. It was completely racist in the whole structure of the quota system.
Between 1900 and 1910, the US admitted more than 8 million immigrants. After the new law is passed in 1924, numbers are far smaller. Immigration is now limited to just 165,000 a year. 87% come from Northern and Western Europe, above all from Germany, Great Britain and Ireland. Only 11% are from Eastern and Southern Europe, mainly Poland and Italy. These American laws will have a wide-ranging influence.
American immigration law was much praised on the far right all over Europe in the 1920s and 1930s. And they pointed to the United States as the model of a country taking important steps in the direction of the larger march toward white supremacy in the world. Hitler himself cited American immigration law, and so did many other Nazis. Hitler described the America that had produced these laws as the first nation that was making progress, however tentative and limited, toward the creation of a healthy race-based polity of the kind the Nazis themselves intended to create.
In Mein Kampf, Hitler refers directly to the laws in the USA.
By simply excluding certain races from attaining citizenship, the United States is already committing itself to a conception that is implicit to the ethnically based state.
But Hitler's racist mania goes much further. He's already adjusting his terminology for supposedly inferior beings, especially Jews, by using murderous analogies. He compares them to pathogens, germs that must be combated.
Jewry mimics, as he puts it. That's to say, it tries to blend in racially too, by marrying into the so-called host people, so that it can no longer be recognized. It embeds itself like a germ into the social body. That's biological racism par excellence, and it must be excreted.
The visionaries of mass murder reject any contradictions. This is fanaticism as self-fulfilling prophecy.
The National Socialists present their race theories as scientifically based. And once they've convinced themselves that they're based on science, then they believe them. And then the National Socialists base their whole sense of themselves on that. And they can implement those theories with all the brutal thoroughness of the political means at their disposal.
At the end of the 1920s, radical anti-Semites are still politically insignificant. What would need to happen to enable them to put their murderous program into action? In 1928, parliamentary elections are due, in a Germany of contradictions. On the one side, democracy and cultural and economic progress. On the other, the rejection of democracy and militarism. The NSDAP, banned since the putsch, is allowed to stand again.
What distinguished the National Socialist German Workers' Party from all the other parties was the extreme youth of its members. The average age of new members in its early years was 25 to 27. And what also distinguished it from the other parties was the very small proportion of women.
By 1928, Hitler has been the undisputed party leader for a long time. He sets the tone. In the forthcoming election campaign, too.
Hitler
now sets his sights on social groups that up till now have not supported the National Socialists. He's already won over all the radical anti-Semites. Now it's time to turn the NSDAP into a party with real mass appeal.
Throughout the campaign, the party stirs up hatred against international high finance, nationalist code for Jews. Hitler fulminates against the Versailles Treaty, against communists and Democrats. On May the 20th, 1928, the Germans vote to strengthen the Republic. The Social Democrats, the SPD, receive most votes, 29.8%. The right, conservative and skeptical of democracy, lose support. The umbrella party of the right, the DNVP, gets 14.2%. Just 2.6% of Germans vote NSDAP. They're a splinter party. Even so, 12 NSDAP deputies take their seats in the Reichstag. They have one goal: to destroy the system they despise from within.
Hitler is still the leader of a very small political party. Most contemporaries would have found it pretty absurd if someone had said that Hitler would one day become Reichschancellor.
Just 5 years later, Hitler will seize power. German democracy will not defend itself.